I can correct it. These words, spoken by a man with nothing, would forever change the life of a man who had everything. The unlikely encounter between a homeless beggar and a desperate billionaire would reveal that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in wisdom and compassion. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The marker screeched across the whiteboard, leaving a harsh line that seemed to cut through the air itself. The sound silenced the tense boardroom on the 42nd floor of Smith Aerospace headquarters in Manhattan. Afternoon sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the desperation on every face. John Smith, the billionaire CEO of Smith Aerospace, gripped the polished conference table with such force that his knuckles turned white. His eyes, red-rimmed from sleepless nights, surveyed the room with a mixture of anger and fear. 48 hours, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of an empire on the brink. If we fail again, we lose everything. The contracts, the investors, the company itself. The ultimatum hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Around the oval table, 12 of America's top aerospace engineers sat frozen, their expressions a gallery of defeat. Laptops displayed the same troubling data, charts pointing downward, simulations ending in failure. The air conditioning hummed quietly, a counterpoint to the thick silence of dread that had settled over the room. "We've tried everything," a senior engineer finally muttered, dropping her pen in surrender. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, a low, steady tone that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "I can correct it." Heads turned toward the doorway. Standing there was a disheveled man in his early 40s. Michael Johnson wore a tattered coat that had once been navy blue, now faded to an indeterminate shade. His dust-caked shoes left faint marks on the pristine carpet. In his hands, he clutched a worn brown bag, holding it with the care one might reserve for precious jewels. Two security guards immediately moved toward the intruder, their faces hardening with professional concern. How had this vagrant made it past the lobby security, through the badge-protected elevators, and into the most critical meeting at Smith Aerospace? John raised his hand abruptly. "Wait!" The command stopped the guards mid-stride. The billionaire's gaze locked with the beggar's. Where John expected to find madness or desperation, he instead saw something startling: clarity. The stranger's eyes were calm and certain, filled with an intelligence that seemed utterly at odds with his appearance. The beggar never wavered, never flinched under the scrutiny of the room's collective stare. He simply repeated, with quiet confidence, "I can correct it." Michael gazed at the chaotic whiteboard, its tangled lines and clashing arrows drawing a grim portrait of failure. "I can correct it," he said again, his voice resonant with quiet conviction. The room fell into an uneasy hush, curiosity battling skepticism. John Smith's expression shifted between desperate hope and professional suspicion as he studied the disheveled stranger who had somehow breached his company's security. "Who let you in here?" demanded a voice from the back. Robert Brown, the lead engineer, stepped forward with narrowed eyes. His perfectly pressed suit and meticulously styled hair stood in stark contrast to Michael's appearance. Michael Johnson didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the equations, mind already solving problems others couldn't see. The years of hardship had stripped away his possessions, but not his brilliance. Just hours before, Michael had awoken beneath the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge, the cold morning air biting through his thin coat. His most precious possessions, a battered aeronautical engineering book, a bundle of faded certificates, and an almost empty pen, were cradled in his arms. These weren't merely objects. They were fragments of his former life, reminders of who he had been before everything collapsed. Washing his face at a public tap, he caught his reflection in a puddle and forced a fleeting smile before joining the early rush toward Manhattan. The stream of suited professionals flowed around him, their coffee cups and briefcases marking them as part of a world he once belonged to. "Sir, I believe there's a fundamental error in your approach," Michael said, pointing toward a specific section of equations. The sensor calibration algorithm doesn't account for atmospheric pressure variations during rapid altitude changes. The boardroom remained silent. Several engineers exchanged glances, some dismissive, others curious. Robert crossed his arms defensively. "How would you know that?" John asked, his voice softer now, desperation making him willing to listen to anyone, even a beggar. Michael's fingers twitched slightly, muscle memory from years of writing complex equations. "I've seen this problem before," he answered simply, not yet ready to reveal his past. A young engineer at the table leaned forward. "Let him try," she whispered to John. "What do we have to lose?" The billionaire CEO hesitated, weighing 48 hours of impending doom against the unlikely prospect that this stranger might actually possess the solution. The fate of Smith Aerospace and thousands of jobs hung in the balance. "Give him the marker," John finally said, his decision made. The skyscraper housing Smith Aerospace always caught Michael's eye, its mirrored glass shimmering with the dreams he once had. 72 stories of ambition and innovation, the building stood as a monument to everything he'd lost. Each morning for the past 3 years, Michael Johnson would pause across the street, coffee cup extended for spare change, watching employees stride purposefully through the revolving doors. Today was different. The familiar ache of envy mingled with something new: determination. Michael clutched his worn brown bag tighter against his side, feeling the outline of his battered engineering book press against his ribs. The morning headlines had screamed about Smith Aerospace's troubles. Failed test flights, plummeting stocks, whispers of bankruptcy. "Maybe today," he whispered to himself, fingers tracing the company logo etched on the building directory. The lobby hummed with nervous energy. Security guards checked badges with unusual scrutiny, while anxious employees huddled in small groups, voices low and faces tense. Digital displays flashed company announcements, but the stock ticker told the real story: another 8% drop since opening bell. Michael moved with practiced invisibility. Years on the streets had taught him how to blend in, to become part of the background noise that busy people filtered out. He slipped past the security desk during a shift change, nodding confidently as if he belonged. No one questioned the disheveled man. In their panic, he was simply another problem they didn't have time to address. The elevator carried him upward, his heart pounding harder with each passing floor. When the doors opened on the executive level, he stepped into a world he once belonged to. Polished marble floors, hushed conversations, the subtle scent of expensive cologne and desperation. Through the glass walls of the main boardroom, Michael could see them. A dozen engineers clustered around digital displays, their body language screaming defeat. At the head of the table stood John Smith, the billionaire whose face graced magazine covers and financial news segments. Now, that famous face was drawn with exhaustion, shoulders slumped beneath his tailored suit. 48 hours, the CEO was saying, his voice barely audible through the glass. 48 hours or we lose everything. Something stirred in Michael's chest, not just the hunger that had become his constant companion, but a different kind of hunger. The need to solve, to fix, to create. Knowledge that had lain dormant for years sparked to life. He tightened his grip on his bag and stepped forward, pushing open the boardroom door with quiet confidence. All heads turned toward the intrusion, expressions shifting from surprise to confusion to disdain. But Michael didn't see their judgment. His eyes were fixed on the whiteboard covered in equations. Equations he immediately recognized were wrong. Back in the boardroom, John Smith's piercing gaze locked onto Michael. The tension in the room crystallized as the billionaire CEO straightened his posture, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "What did you say?" he demanded, each word measured and deliberate. Michael Johnson stood his ground, unflinching despite his ragged appearance. "I can correct it. Let me try," he repeated, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with his tattered coat and worn shoes. Murmurs rippled through the assembled engineers, some mocking, others wary. Glances were exchanged across the polished conference table, a mixture of disbelief and disdain. A young engineer with a pristine badge and carefully pressed shirt scoffed, loudly enough for everyone to hear. What could he possibly know that we don't? The homeless man's eyes never wavered, even as whispers about security and protocols filled the air. He simply stood, patient and steady, like someone who had weathered far worse storms than corporate skepticism. John's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The desperation that had been etched into his features moments before now mingled with something else, a flicker of wild hope. The aerospace titan had built an empire on calculated risks, and the company's impending collapse had pushed him to the edge. What more did he have to lose? Desperation makes even the brave bolder, John muttered, almost to himself. With deliberate slowness, he slid the marker across the polished surface of the conference table. It rolled to a stop just inches from Michael's weathered hand. "If you waste our time," the CEO said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "you waste my company. Don't waste it." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy with consequence. The room fell into a tense silence, suspended between hope and ridicule. The top engineers, men and women who had dedicated their careers to solving impossible problems, watched with expressions ranging from amusement to outright hostility as the disheveled stranger approached the whiteboard. Michael picked up the marker, its weight familiar in his hand, despite the years that had passed since he'd last held one. For a moment, he simply stood before the chaotic equations and diagrams, studying them with the practiced eye of someone returning to a language they once knew fluently. Then, with surprising steadiness, he uncapped the marker. The small click echoed in the silent room as every eye fixed on his first move. With a steady hand that belied his ragged appearance, Michael Johnson erased the tangled mess of arrows on the whiteboard. The room fell silent as he redrew a single clear line, flowing like a river across the white expanse. His movements were precise, almost elegant, stark contrast to his worn clothing. He circled a small box labeled AOA and wrote beside it, "Senso drift under vibration." The marker squeaked as he added 3 equations, each one elegant in its simplicity. Just enough mathematics to illuminate the path forward without overwhelming the observers. "Feedback loop overreacts," he wrote next, underlining the phrase once for emphasis. Near the tail of his sketched aircraft, he added a small smiley face, an unexpected touch of humanity amid the technical chaos. Several engineers exchanged glances, unsure whether to be impressed or skeptical. "What are you saying exactly?" challenged a young engineer from the back of the room, her voice sharp with doubt. Michael turned, his eyes calm but intense. "When the aircraft experiences multiple minor vibrations, this sensor misinterprets the angle of attack. It believes the nose is too high and triggers a panic response." He tapped the whiteboard with the marker. "The autopilot compensates by forcing the nose down excessively, and the pilots naturally resist. This creates a dangerous tug-of-war." He paused, allowing the information to sink in. "A mere few seconds of corrupted data can lead to catastrophe." With methodical precision, he drew a filter system on the board. "The solution is straightforward. We slow the panic response and implement cross-verification." His voice grew stronger as he explained. "We check against 2 additional parameters, airspeed and vertical speed measurements. If all 3 indicators agree, then the system acts. If there's disagreement, it waits for confirmation." John Smith leaned forward, his earlier desperation giving way to cautious hope. The other engineers were now fully engaged, some taking notes, others nodding slowly as understanding dawned. "It's elegant," whispered one of the senior team members. "So simple we overlooked it." Michael continued drawing, adding connections between systems. His expertise was undeniable, flowing through him as naturally as breathing. For a moment, no one saw the tattered coat or the dust on his shoes. They saw only the brilliant mind that had somehow found its way to their boardroom at the precise moment they needed it most. The whiteboard, once a chaotic jumble of failed approaches, now displayed a clear solution that might save not only Smith Aerospace, but potentially countless lives. And it had come from the most unexpected source, a man who had been invisible to society until he chose to step forward and simply say, "I can correct it." He wrote 3 steps on the whiteboard with deliberate strokes: filter the noise, cross-check the helpers, soft hands on the nose, soft hands. The peculiar phrasing hung in the air, technical yet strangely poetic. Though the words seemed odd, they resonated with everyone present. The room collectively leaned forward, as if drawn by an invisible force. Pens that had been frantically scribbling moments before now lay motionless. Even the persistent hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of expected breathing. John Smith stepped closer, his expensive shoes making soft impressions in the plush carpet. The billionaire's curiosity had finally overcome his pride. His eyes, no longer just reflecting desperation, now showed something new, a cautious hope. "You? What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than anyone in the room had heard in weeks. Michael never turned from the board, his fingers still tracing the equations he'd written. Michael Johnson," he replied, his voice steady despite the weight of all those eyes upon him. "Where did you learn this?" John pressed, moving even closer now, studying the disheveled man as if seeing him for the first time. Michael tapped the pocket of his tattered coat, where the outline of his precious book was visible. The gesture was reverent, like a priest touching a sacred text. "From before, from work, from mistakes," he answered, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Then, with unexpected poetry, he added, "From listening to the sky when numbers get scared." The engineers exchanged glances. This wasn't the language of textbooks or technical manuals. It was the voice of someone who didn't just understand the mathematics, he felt it. One of the younger team members whispered to his colleague, "Is he for real?" The senior engineer beside him nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the whiteboard. "I think he might be." John circled around to face Michael directly. The CEO's tailored suit contrasted sharply with Michael's worn clothing. Yet in this moment, the power dynamic had shifted. The billionaire was no longer the authority in the room. The homeless man with the quiet confidence had claimed that role without even trying. "Soft hands," John repeated, testing the phrase. "You mean a gentler algorithm response?" Michael nodded, finally turning to meet John's gaze. Machines panic. They overcorrect, like humans who grab the wheel too hard when they're afraid. He made a gentle motion with his hands. Soft hands save lives. A senior engineer, with graying hair at her temples, leaned forward, her voice carrying both caution and curiosity. "We actually tried implementing a filter last week," she said, tapping her pen against her notepad. "It worked perfectly for mild turbulence scenarios, but completely failed when conditions got rougher." Michael Johnson nodded thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving the whiteboard. He drew a neat box labeled Human Override with a time gate beside it. His movements were precise despite his worn appearance, revealing years of practiced expertise. "The key is to give the pilot a stronger voice early in the process," he explained. "Not after the fight between human and machine has already begun." His finger traced the connection between the override and the main system. "Let the system learn from the pilot's calm responses. The machine must not be proud." Several engineers exchanged glances, reluctant smiles breaking through their professional facades. The personification of the aircraft system as something capable of pride struck a chord. They'd all witnessed how stubbornly automation could override human judgment. From the back of the room, another engineer raised his hand. His skepticism was evident in his furrowed brow and crossed arms. What happens if all three helpers, these sensors, give false comm readings simultaneously? The system would still fail catastrophically. The boardroom fell silent, all eyes shifting between the skeptical engineer and the disheveled man who had appeared from nowhere with solutions they hadn't considered. Michael stood firm, his response immediate and confident. "Not likely to happen simultaneously," he said. "But if they do, we add what I call a heartbeat checker." He sketched a small monitoring system on the whiteboard. It performs a sanity check every 0.3 seconds on all incoming data. His marker moved across the board, creating a simple flowchart. If anything looks strange, even slightly off, we warn the pilot first, before any automatic corrections. He tapped the marker against the board for emphasis. Always soft hands. John Smith watched from the side, his earlier desperation giving way to cautious hope. The engineering team's body language had shifted, leaning forward instead of slumped back, eyes alert instead of defeated. "Soft hands," one of the younger team members repeated quietly, as if testing how the philosophy felt in their own mouth. Michael nodded. "Exactly, like holding a bird, firm enough to keep it safe, gentle enough not to harm it." He placed the marker down and stepped back from the whiteboard, allowing the room to absorb his solution. The contrast between his tattered appearance and the elegant simplicity of his design couldn't have been more stark. A different kind of silence settled over the boardroom, a silence filled with hope, as if a locked door had suddenly opened. The engineers exchanged glances, their expressions transforming from skepticism to cautious optimism. John Smith looked around the table. A few of his team members nodded slightly, not wanting to break the spell that had fallen over them. "Build a quick sim," John ordered, his voice cutting through the silence with renewed purpose. "Use his method. We run it now." The command sparked immediate action. Laptops snapped open around the conference table, fingers flying across keyboards with newfound energy. The projector hummed to life, casting a digital sky across the wall of Smith Aerospace's headquarters. Lines of code appeared on screens as the engineers worked with a synchronicity they hadn't shown in weeks. The atmosphere had shifted. Where despair had reigned just minutes before, now possibility hung in the air. Even the most skeptical team members leaned forward in their chairs, eager to see if this unlikely savior solution would actually work. As the simulation loaded, John moved closer to Michael, studying the disheveled man who had appeared from nowhere with answers his highly paid team couldn't find. "Michael what?" he asked quietly, realizing he didn't even know the full name of the man who might save his company. "Michael Johnson," came the simple reply, the beggar's eyes never leaving the whiteboard where his equations still stood. He seemed transfixed by his own work, as if reconnecting with a part of himself long buried. Up close, John could see the depth in Michael's eyes, the kind of depth that comes only from experiencing both tremendous joy and devastating heartbreak. These weren't the eyes of an ordinary homeless man. They were the eyes of someone who had soared high and fallen hard. Despite the tattered coat and the dust that still clung to his shoes, there was an unmistakable dignity in his bearing. The CEO found himself wondering what series of events could possibly have led someone with such obvious brilliance to end up sleeping under the Brooklyn Bridge. What tragedy had befallen this man? What injustice had pushed him from designing aircraft to begging on streets? Around them, the engineers worked feverishly, translating Michael's elegant solution into digital reality. The projector's light illuminated their faces, casting long shadows across the room as they prepared to test whether this stranger's insight could truly save them all from ruin. The simulation began with an ominous hum, all eyes in the boardroom fixed on the large projection screen as the virtual aircraft started its journey. John Smith's fingers dug into the leather chairback, his posture rigid with anticipation. The model plane rolled down the digital runway, lifted gracefully into the air, and then hit the programmed wind shear, the exact conditions that had caused their previous catastrophic failures. Under the old system, the aircraft would have immediately plunged its nose downward, triggering a cascade of errors. Michael Johnson leaned forward, his newly washed face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. "Soft hands," he whispered, not as an incantation, but as a coach might encourage an athlete at a crucial moment. The engineers exchanged skeptical glances, but their attention quickly returned to the simulation. The new filter Michael had designed caught the turbulence, processing it through his innovative algorithm. The three helpers, angle of attack, airspeed, and vertical speed, cross-checked each other in milliseconds, creating a consensus rather than allowing a single faulty sensor to dominate. The heartbeat checker ticked in the corner of the screen, steady, 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 confirming the system's sanity at 0.3 intervals. The CEO's grip tightened on the chair until his knuckles turned white. Everyone watched as the numbers in the corner of the display danced. A concerning dip, then an alarming spike, followed by something they hadn't seen before, a gentle, controlled curve. The pilot's override indicator flashed briefly, and remarkably, the system yielded to the human input, learning to listen rather than fight back. "It's working," breathed a young engineer, breaking the tense silence. The graph that had previously screamed with jagged red peaks now flowed in calm, undulating waves of green. The aircraft maintained its course through the virtual storm, stable and responsive. The result box in the corner began to flicker, the program calculating its final assessment. Suddenly, the lights overhead blinked. The projector dimmed, then went dark. The entire room plunged into momentary darkness as the building's power faltered. "No!" someone shouted. Laptop batteries kept a few screens glowing as backup generators hummed to life somewhere in the building's depths. Gasps erupted across the boardroom, engineers frantically tapping at keyboards, trying to recover the simulation data. For a heartbeat, the hope that had begun to blossom seemed crushed by cruel timing. The lights blinked back on, one by one. The projector sputtered, then reawakened with a mechanical sigh, freezing on the frame captured just before the power failure. The room collectively held its breath, waiting for the system to recover and reveal the truth they all desperately needed to see. The room plunged into darkness as the power failed. Gasps erupted from the engineers, while laptop batteries kicked in, their screens casting eerie blue light across worried faces. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing everyone in an anxious glow. For those crucial seconds, the simulation's outcome remained hidden, suspended between failure and salvation. "Just our luck," someone muttered from the back of the room. John Smith gripped the edge of the conference table, his knuckles white with tension. The CEO's gaze darted between the blank projector screen and Michael Johnson, searching for any hint of disappointment or triumph on the former engineer's face. Michael remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the darkened screen, a man accustomed to waiting through life's crueler moments. "Generator should kick in any second," a voice called out. As if responding to the command, the lights hummed back to life. Computer fans whirred, air conditioning resumed its gentle background noise, and the projector sputtered awake with a mechanical sigh. The image flickered, then stabilized, freezing on the frame just before the simulation's conclusion. The room collectively held its breath. Engineers leaned forward in their chairs, some standing to get a better view. No one spoke, no one moved. The only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock, counting down the seconds of their shared suspense. Then, the final result appeared in bold green letters across the screen. Success. The room exploded with emotion. Two younger engineers jumped from their seats, high-fiving each other with unrestrained joy. The senior engineer, who had questioned Michael earlier, clasped her hands to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Others simply stared at the screen, processing what they were seeing. The chaotic red spikes that had plagued their design for months had transformed into a smooth, peaceful wave. It worked, whispered an engineer near the front, her voice barely audible above the growing celebration. John stared at the screen, his expression transforming from desperate hope to overwhelming relief. The billionaire's shoulders sagged as if a massive weight had suddenly lifted. He blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that threatened to betray the depth of his emotion. "Run it again," he commanded, his voice hoarse. "Different conditions, maximum turbulence." The team complied immediately. The simulation restarted, this time with parameters pushed to their limits. Everyone watched, barely breathing, as the virtual aircraft encountered violent turbulence. The system responded exactly as Michael had predicted, with patience, cross-checks, and what he had called soft hands. Once again, the green success flashed across the screen. A spontaneous round of applause broke out, echoing against the glass walls of the boardroom. The impossible had become possible. Smith Aerospace had found its salvation in the most unlikely place, a homeless man with dust on his shoes and genius in his mind. "It worked," whispered an engineer, awe in her voice. The simulation results glowed on the screen, confirming what seemed impossible moments before. Michael Johnson let the marker fall gently into the tray, his hands trembling not with fear, but with memory, a flood of years spent unseen, unheard, and unwanted. For the first time in forever, his ideas had weight again. The boardroom remained silent for 3 heartbeats. Then one engineer stood, clapping slowly. Another joined, then another, until the entire room erupted in applause. They weren't celebrating their billionaire boss or the salvation of Smith Aerospace. They were honoring the ragged man who had solved what none of them could. Michael stood awkwardly in his tattered coat, dust still clinging to his shoes. His eyes glistened as he absorbed this moment of recognition. How long had it been since someone had seen his value? Since his mind had been allowed to soar again, John Smith pushed through the crowd, his face transformed. Gone was the tense, desperate CEO with white knuckles and red-rimmed eyes. Tears streamed freely down his cheeks as he approached Michael. "You did it," John said, his voice barely audible above the applause. "You actually did it." Without warning, the billionaire pulled Michael into a tight embrace. The contrast couldn't have been starker. The impeccably dressed executive holding the homeless man as if he were the most precious person in the world. "Thank you," John whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thank you." Michael stood frozen, overwhelmed by human contact after years of people crossing streets to avoid him. Slowly, his arms rose to return the embrace. The engineers watched in stunned silence. Some wiped away tears, while others exchanged glances of disbelief. The impossible had happened in this glass-walled boardroom high above Manhattan. When John finally released him, Michael took a step back, suddenly self-conscious of his appearance, the smell of the streets that clung to him, the stark difference between himself and everyone else in the room. "I just saw what needed fixing," he said softly, eyes downcast. "No," John replied firmly. "You saw what we couldn't. What I couldn't." He turned to face his team. This man just saved Smith Aerospace, and he did it with 3 words: soft hands. The room erupted in laughter and renewed applause. Michael felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Pride, yes, but something more. Hope. For the first time since his world had collapsed, Michael Johnson dared to hope that perhaps his story wasn't over after all. "You just saved my company, and maybe more lives than we can count." The words hung in the air, heavy with gratitude and disbelief. The security guards by the door shifted uncomfortably, their earlier suspicion replaced by confusion. No one in the room could deny it now. Michael Johnson wasn't an intruder or a madman. He was their salvation. John Smith gestured toward the hallway. "My office, now." His tone wasn't commanding, but almost reverent. Minutes later, Michael sank into the plush leather chair across from John's mahogany desk. The softness beneath him felt alien, a stark, almost painful contrast to the unyielding concrete that had been his bed for years. He ran his fingertips over the armrest, remembering a time when such luxury had been commonplace in his life. His worn brown bag sat faithfully by his side, containing everything he'd managed to keep from his former life. The billionaire paced back and forth, his expensive shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sprawled below them, a city that had both broken and remade Michael. "I don't understand," John finally said, stopping to lean against his desk. "You walked in from the street and saw what my best engineers couldn't. Who are you, really?" Michael's gaze dropped to his hands, clean now, but still bearing the calluses of street life. He hesitated, memories flooding back of boardrooms not unlike this one, where his opinion had once carried weight. After a long moment, he reached into his bag and carefully extracted his most precious possession. The battered aeronautical engineering book, its cover worn thin from countless readings, made a soft thud as he placed it on the gleaming desk. "This is who I used to be," he said quietly. John stared at the book, then back at Michael. The CEO's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. He reached for the volume, handling it with unexpected reverence, and opened to the first page where an inscription was still visible. "To Michael Johnson, whose brilliance will change the skies, Professor Williams, MIT. "An engineer," John whispered, looking up at the disheveled man with new understanding. "Not just any engineer." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "Once, yes." The billionaire slowly lowered himself into his chair, the book still open in his hands. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Michael took a deep breath. For the first time in years, someone was ready to hear his story. John Smith settled into his chair, the leather creaking beneath him as he leaned forward with genuine interest. "Tell me," he urged, his voice softer than the commanding tone he used in the boardroom. Michael Johnson's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his past visible in every line of his face. "I was once a top aeronautical engineer," he began, his voice heavy with memories. "I worked for big companies here in the States, solved problems, lived in the sky. I had a family, a wife, Sarah, and 2 boys, David and James. For a time, I thought I was blessed." His fingers traced the worn edge of his engineering book, the pages yellowed with time and handling. "We had a house in Connecticut, a dog named Chester. The boys played Little League. I designed safety systems for commercial aircraft." A ghost of a smile crossed his face before fading. "But doubt crept in," Michael continued, his eyes clouding. "Sarah started working late, taking calls in another room. The boys, they didn't look like me. Against my better judgment, I had a DNA test done." He paused, swallowing hard. "The results said they weren't mine." The billionaire's expression remained neutral, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest. "The next day, police found drugs in my briefcase at work. High-grade cocaine, hidden in a compartment I'd never seen before." Michael's voice became hollow. "I was arrested, convicted, jailed for 2 years. By the time I got out, I'd lost everything. My security clearance, my professional licenses, my reputation." He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the city beyond. "Sarah had already divorced me, taken the boys to California. My savings went to legal fees. Then came deportation, a technicality with my green card." The engineer's voice cracked slightly. "When I finally made it back to the States, I had nothing. No credentials, no references, no address. This bag," he touched the worn brown bag beside him, "it's all I have left of who I was." John's throat tightened as he processed the story. The contrast was stark. This brilliant mind who had just saved his multi-billion-dollar company had been sleeping under bridges, invisible to the world that once celebrated his genius. "You never tried to clear your name?" the CEO asked quietly. Michael shook his head. "Who would believe me? A convicted felon against a respected corporation? Sometimes, it's easier to disappear. John Smith's throat tightened as the weight of Michael Johnson's story settled between them. "You went from designing planes to sleeping under bridges," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the hushed office. The billionaire's fingers drummed against his mahogany desk, a nervous habit betraying his usually composed demeanor. For a moment, the two men sat in silence, their worlds apart, yet connected by tragedy and genius. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite, highlighting the stark contrast between John's tailored suit and Michael's worn attire. "Genius can be buried, but it never dies," John finally said, his voice firm with newfound conviction. He stood up suddenly, his chair rolling backward with the abrupt movement. "That's what they never understood when they took everything from you." Michael looked down at his weathered hands, the same hands that had just redrawn equations that would save countless lives. "I've been invisible for so long," he admitted quietly. "Sometimes I wondered if the man I used to be had died completely." Without hesitation, John reached for his smartphone and called his driver. "James, I need you at the office immediately." He paused, glancing at Michael's disheveled appearance with determination rather than judgment. "Take Mr. Johnson to Harlow's on Fifth Avenue, the best barber they have. Then to Westfield's for a complete wardrobe." His tone left no room for negotiation. "He doesn't come back here looking like the world forgot him." Michael tried to protest, rising from his seat with palms raised. "I can't accept." "You can and you will," John interrupted, his CEO authority surfacing naturally. The businessman crossed the room in 3 quick strides and placed a firm hand on Michael's shoulder. "You gave me back my company. I give you back your life." The former engineer's eyes glistened with unexpected emotion. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" John's expression softened. "Because talent like yours doesn't belong under a bridge. It belongs here, solving the impossible." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a company badge, already printed with Michael's name and the title Lead Engineer. "How did you—" Michael started. "I made the decision the moment your simulation succeeded," John explained, pressing the badge into Michael's palm. "The world took everything from you based on lies. I'm just returning what should have been yours all along. Dignity, purpose, recognition." As Michael stared at the badge in his hand, a tentative smile, the first genuine one in years, began to form on his face. Outside the office windows, the New York skyline stretched endlessly, no longer a taunting reminder of what he'd lost, but a canvas of possibility for what might come next. That night, Michael Johnson sat motionless in the leather chair as the barber worked his magic. Each snip of the scissors seemed to cut away years of hardship. The mirror reflected a transformation happening before his eyes, the wild, matted beard giving way to a neatly trimmed outline that framed his jaw. His hair, once a tangled mess, now fell in clean, dignified lines. "What do you think, sir?" the barber asked, stepping back. Michael leaned forward, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. The haunted eyes remained, but they now belonged to someone who might be respected, even admired. He ran his fingers along his smooth cheek, remembering a time when this appearance had been routine rather than miraculous. "It's perfect," he whispered. At the boutique, the attendant measured him with practiced efficiency. Michael stood still, uncomfortable with the attention, but grateful for John Smith's generosity. When he slipped into the tailored suit, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, a forgotten confidence returned to his posture. The fabric felt foreign against his skin after years of tattered layers, yet somehow familiar, like an old friend returning. "You look exceptional, sir," the attendant commented, adjusting his tie. Michael studied his reflection. The suit transformed him completely, from invisible to commanding. For the first time in years, he recognized himself. Not just the outer shell, but the engineer, the problem solver, the man who once had dreams beyond survival. The next morning, he approached the Smith Aerospace building with steady steps. The same security guards who had nearly thrown him out now nodded respectfully, one even holding the door. The lobby that had intimidated him just days ago now welcomed him with its polished floors and soaring ceilings. In the elevator, he straightened his tie, heart pounding. The doors opened to reveal John waiting, a broad smile lighting his face. "Ready?" the CEO asked. Michael nodded, swallowing hard. They walked together into the main conference room where the entire engineering team had gathered. Conversations hushed as heads turned toward them. Many faces registered shock. The transformation from disheveled beggar to polished professional was startling. John raised his hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice ringing with pride, "I'd like to introduce lead engineer Michael Johnson. This man saved us all. He is your leader now." The applause began hesitantly, then swelled to fill the room, thunderous and overwhelming. Michael stood tall, accepting their recognition with a humble nod. He noticed most faces showed genuine welcome, though a few, particularly Robert Brown's, contained thinly veiled envy beneath forced smiles. For Michael, the sound was sweeter than any symphony. It wasn't just applause for his solution, it was acknowledgement of his existence after years of invisibility. Among the crowd, one man's eyes burned with resentment. Robert Brown, the former lead engineer. Forced a smile but seethed inside. Michael's rise was a threat to everything he'd built. Every clap from Michael was a hammer on Robert's pride. Brilliant work on the sensor calibration. A junior engineer gushed to Michael as Robert passed by, pretending not to hear. He gripped his coffee mug so tightly it nearly cracked. For 15 years, he had been the brightest mind at Smith Aerospace, the one John called first when problems arose. Now, he was practically invisible. In the weeks that followed, Michael proved himself again and again. He simplified the navigation systems that had baffled the team for months, uncovered hidden flaws in the fuel distribution mechanism, and led the engineering department to new heights. His approach wasn't just technical brilliance. It was the way he listened, the way he made complex ideas accessible to everyone from executives to maintenance staff. The Johnson method became shorthand throughout the industry for elegant problem-solving. Contracts flooded in from commercial airlines, military branches, even foreign governments eager to upgrade their fleets. The Wall Street Journal ran a feature calling Smith Aerospace's turnaround the Miracle of Manhattan. Robert watched from the shadows of meetings as Michael sketched solutions on whiteboards, the same boards where Robert's own ideas had once taken flight. "He got lucky once," he muttered to himself, while deleting another company-wide email praising Michael's latest innovation. At the quarterly investors meeting, John stood proudly beside Michael, hand on his shoulder. "6 months ago, we were 48 hours from bankruptcy," the CEO announced to thunderous applause. "Today, our stock has tripled, and we've secured contracts through the next decade." What stung Robert most wasn't just the professional acclaim, it was how the team had embraced Michael. Junior engineers who once trembled when Robert entered a room now lingered after hours, surrounding Michael's desk, absorbing his wisdom over takeout containers and laughter. He came from nothing. Robert overheard a colleague whisper in the break room. "Literally sleeping under the Brooklyn Bridge, and now he's revolutionizing aerospace engineering." That night, Robert sat alone in his luxury apartment overlooking Central Park, surrounded by awards and certificates that suddenly seemed hollow. On his laptop screen, he pulled up Michael's personnel file, the one he'd secretly accessed using his administrative privileges. Something about the former beggar's miraculous rise didn't add up, and Robert was determined to find the flaw in this perfect redemption story. "Everyone has secrets," he whispered, scrolling through Michael's past, "and I'll find yours." The engineering floor at Smith Aerospace had transformed in the weeks since Michael Johnson's arrival. Where tension once hung like a storm cloud, a sense of purpose now energized the team. Michael moved through the workspace with quiet confidence, his formerly disheveled appearance replaced by crisp button-downs and neatly trimmed hair. "What if we adjust the threshold here?" asked Samantha, a junior engineer, pointing to a simulation on her laptop. Michael leaned in, his eyes scanning the data before offering a suggestion. He never dismissed ideas outright, instead guiding his team through problems with thoughtful questions. "Try it," he encouraged. "Sometimes the simplest solutions are hiding in plain sight." The younger engineers especially gravitated toward him, drawn by his patience and willingness to explain complex concepts without condescension. They'd taken to calling him mentor when they thought he couldn't hear, though the slight smile that crossed his face suggested he knew. "He listens like no one else," one engineer confided to another over coffee. "It's like he's been on both sides of every problem." While Michael built bridges, Robert Brown built walls. The former lead engineer watched from his glass-walled office, jaw clenched, as Michael held court with a group of engineers who once sought Robert's approval. Each day brought fresh reminders of his displacement. His technical suggestions, once treated as gospel, now faced scrutiny against Michael's innovative approaches. The final blow came when Aviation Weekly featured Smith Aerospace on its cover. The miracle turnaround blazed across the page, with a photo of John and Michael standing shoulder to shoulder at a press conference. The article praised the mysterious genius who had revolutionized their flight systems. Robert slammed the magazine down on his desk, startling an intern passing by. "Sorry," he muttered, not meaning it. That evening, after most staff had departed, Robert remained, staring at his computer screen without seeing it. The office hummed with the quiet sounds of cleaning crews moving through distant corridors. He pulled up the company's latest performance reports. Profits soaring, stock prices climbing, all credited to innovations led by Michael's team. "It should have been me," Robert whispered to the empty room, his reflection in the darkened window looking back at him with hollow eyes. "I gave 15 years to this company." He opened his drawer and removed a small notebook. Flipping to a page where he'd scribbled an address and phone number, his finger traced over the digits as his mind filled with shadows. In the darkness of his office, Robert began to plot, unaware that the security camera in the corner captured his every move. Amid the professional triumphs that had transformed his life, Michael Johnson discovered something he hadn't dared to hope for: love. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when he bumped into Emily Davis near the accounting department, spilling her stack of quarterly reports across the hallway floor. "I'm so sorry," he said, kneeling to gather the scattered papers. "No harm done," Emily replied with a warm smile that reached her eyes. Unlike others who saw only his remarkable comeback story, she noticed the vulnerability behind his confident facade, the lingering shadows of a man who had lost everything once before. Their first conversation lasted barely 2 minutes, yet something invisible had connected them. The next day, Emily appeared at his office door with 2 cups of tea. "Thought you might need this," she said, placing the steaming cup on his desk. "You've been staring at those equations for hours." Their connection grew in small, quiet moments. When Michael worked late redesigning critical flight systems, Emily would bring him dinner from the cafeteria. When she struggled with heavy file boxes for the quarterly audit, he was there to help carry the load. Neither made a fuss about these small kindnesses. They simply became part of their shared rhythm. "Have you tried that little diner by the East River?" Emily asked one evening as they walked toward the parking garage. "Their apple pie might change your life." That night at the Riverside Diner, with Manhattan's lights twinkling across the water, Michael laughed genuinely for the first time in years. The accountant's quick wit and thoughtful questions drew him out of his shell. She never pressed about his past, but created space for him to share when ready. "I still wake up sometimes thinking I'm under the bridge," he confessed one evening over coffee. "I reach for my bag, panicked that someone's stolen it." Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "But you're here now." For Michael, These moments with her became anchors in his new reality. After years of bitter cold and rejection, Emily's presence was like stepping into warm sunlight after a devastating storm. She didn't care about his dramatic rise at Smith Aerospace or his growing celebrity in engineering circles. She valued the man beneath the headlines, his patience, his humility, his quiet determination. As spring turned to summer, their evening walks along the East River grew longer. Their conversations deepened. When Emily's hand first slipped into his during a sunset stroll, Michael felt something he thought had been permanently extinguished: hope for a future beyond mere survival. 5 months had passed since Michael Johnson's breakthrough at Smith Aerospace. The Manhattan skyline glittered against the night sky as he led Emily Davis to the rooftop garden of their favorite restaurant by the East River. String lights twinkled overhead, casting a warm glow on her surprised face. "What's all this?" Emily asked, her eyes widening at the rose petals scattered across their path. Michael's heart pounded as he reached into his pocket. The small velvet box felt impossibly heavy in his trembling hand. He'd practiced this moment countless times in his mind, yet now words failed him. Taking a deep breath, he dropped to one knee. "Emily, you found me when I was rebuilding myself," he said softly. "You never saw the beggar, only the man beneath. Will you marry me?" Tears glistened in her eyes as she whispered, "Yes." The accountant's voice broke with emotion as Michael slipped the diamond ring onto her finger. They embraced under the stars, the city lights reflecting in the river below them. News of their engagement spread quickly through the company. John Smith insisted on hosting an extravagant wedding reception and presented them with an extraordinary gift: a spacious home in the suburbs with a garden and a view of the sunrise. When Michael protested, the billionaire simply clasped his shoulder. "You gave me back everything," John said firmly. "Let me do this for you." Standing in the living room of his new home, Michael could scarcely believe how dramatically his life had transformed. Just months ago, he'd been sleeping beneath the Brooklyn Bridge, clutching his worn brown bag of possessions. Now he had a future with Emily, respect from colleagues, and a second chance at the career he loved. But not everyone celebrated his rise. In a dimly lit bar across town, Robert Brown nursed his third whiskey, bitterness etched into every line of his face. The former lead engineer had watched his status erode with every triumph Michael achieved. "Another," Robert muttered to the bartender, sliding his empty glass forward. A man with a jagged scar across his left cheek slid onto the stool beside him. "You Brown?" he asked, voice low. Robert nodded tensely. "I'm Tony. Heard you're looking for some problem-solving." The thug's smile never reached his cold eyes. "I want him ruined," Robert whispered, leaning closer. "Not killed, just destroyed, like he destroyed me." Tony chuckled. "For the right price, we can make that happen." Without hesitation, Robert slid a thick envelope across the sticky bar top. "Half now, half when it's done." As Tony's fingers closed around the payment, Robert felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Soon, Michael Johnson would lose everything, just as he had. The night before Michael's wedding, a gentle silence settled over the mansion. Michael Johnson sat alone in the living room, the warm glow of a single lamp illuminating the worn pages of his treasured engineering book. Emily Davis was staying with her parents, following tradition. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of their life together, a miracle he still couldn't quite believe. His fingers traced the equations that had once been his language, his identity. From sleeping under the Brooklyn Bridge to this luxurious home in the suburbs, the journey felt surreal. John Smith had spared no expense on this wedding gift, insisting Michael deserved every comfort after saving Smith Aerospace from certain ruin. Michael closed the book and leaned back, savoring the moment. The security system hummed quietly in the background, a constant reminder of his newfound safety. Tomorrow, he would stand before friends and colleagues as a whole man again, with Emily by his side. The violent pounding on the front door shattered the peace. Before Michael could react, the wood splintered, and 3 men in dark jackets burst into his sanctuary. He recognized the leader instantly, Tony, with his distinctive facial scar, flanked by 2 muscular associates. "Consider this a wedding present," Tony sneered, raising a pistol. Michael lunged sideways as the weapon discharged. White-hot pain tore through his arm as the bullet found flesh instead of heart. He crashed into the coffee table, sending his precious book sliding across the polished floor. The security alarm erupted into life, its piercing wail filling the house. Tony cursed, clearly not expecting such a sophisticated system. "Finish him," he barked, but his accomplices were already retreating toward the door. "This isn't over," Tony hissed, before following his men into the night. Michael pressed his hand against the wound, warm blood seeping between his fingers. The pristine carpet beneath him darkened with crimson as he fought to stay conscious. The room began to spin, memories of his past losses swirling together with present terror. Through the open door, he could see security guards rushing across the lawn, their flashlights cutting through darkness. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. As consciousness began to slip away, one desperate thought crystallized in Michael's mind. "Not again. I won't lose it all again." He thought of Emily, of John, of the life he had rebuilt from nothing. This time would be different. This time he would fight. The last thing Michael saw before darkness claimed him was his engineering book lying open on the floor, the page displaying an equation about resilience under pressure.